Okay, so these are the Watercolor Techniques. On your board, if you don't have a board, that's okay, but you should have a piece of tape, and you can use masking tape. If you don't have tape, you just need 10 boxes total. So what I did is I have one piece of tape going down the center with 4 pieces of tape going this way. And let me see if I can see that whole thing. Yep. So there should be 10 boxes total. And then for these first 2, I'm just going to go through all these kind of quick, and you can pause and speed up if needed, but I'm going to go through these one by one. So the first 2 that we have are color grade wet on dry, color grade wet on wet, and I'm actually going to start with these 2. I kind of messed up with my order, but intensity grade wet on dry, intensity grade wet on wet. So for supplies, you should have a palette, a brush, an oil pastel, a Sharpie, some water, and a little bit of paper towel. Okay, so intensity grade wet on dry. So the wet on dry means we are applying wet watercolor paint to a dry piece of paper. Wet on wet is the opposite. We wet the paper first and then we apply our paint. So the intensity grade, we should be familiar with that, is one color and it slowly loses its pigment. So I'm going to get my brush kind of wet, not too much water. That's like key, the amount of water that you use. So I'm going to get some water on my brush and go ahead and choose any color that you want. And we're going to pretty much saturate our brush with that pigment. So I'm getting a decent amount, and the nice thing about watercolor palettes is you can test it over here. So that's plenty of pigment on my brush to start. So I'm just going to start laying down this color, and you have to work kind of fast with the watercolor. So I have like a solid bar right there. Then as it loses intensity, I'm just going to add more water and less pigment to my brush. Or I'm going to not add more water, but I'm going to get rid of a little bit of pigment and kind of replace it with water. And I'm going to slowly do that over and over. So little by little, there's less and less pigment on the brush. And if this isn't perfect the first time, that's okay. We're just practicing. Watercolor is pretty tricky. I love it, but I still have my own issues with it. It's like you don't have quite as much control as like a colored pencil. And then like the last few, I'm just going to clean off my brush completely, and I'm going to pull the pigment that I already kind of had. Oh, hold up. Pull that pigment that I already had all the way to the edge. So just like that. So you can kind of see the increments that it slowly changes. Now we're going to do an intensity grade wet on wet. So I'm going to clean off my brush completely, and I'm going to wet this page. Now this isn't going to be sopping wet, but just enough to create this nice effect. So I'm going to use the same color just so it's kind of obvious the difference, but it's going to be the same thing. Really saturate your brush with the color. Kind of got to work fast. And I'm going to lay this down. You can see how it spreads a little bit more. So I got my solid block. Same thing, less pigment as I go on my brush, replacing it with water. like the last little bit there, I just clean off my brush completely and just pull what I already had to the edge. Just like that. Nice. Okay, so now we're going to go back up, kind of backwards. So color grade, wet on dry, color grade, wet on wet. This is the same exact thing, but a color gradation is when you have two colors. So we're going to do the same thing, except there's going to be two colors. I would use a warm color and a warm color, or a cool and a cool. If you do a warm and a cool, sometimes the blend in the center doesn't look very nice. So I'm going to do blue and green. So just straight on the dry paper, solid block right there. And then before I get to the edge, I'm going to switch my color. So same thing, I'm going to saturate my brush, or clean it off first and then saturate it with the second color. And I'm going to put that solid block down for my second color. So I'm doing green. Push this a little bit lower. Same thing. Might have waited too long to blend it with the blue, but that's okay. Just gonna go back, kind of try to blend this. I want to get rid of that solid line. Kind of taper that off. Okay, so that's what, get the glare out of there. Kind of looks like that. Now we're going to do the same thing, but wet your paper first. Clean off your brush completely. And get a solid layer on there. End this one a little sooner than the other one. That taper off, switch my color. Okay, so that's my color grade wet on wet. And now I'm going to move on to these next two. So the next two is a paper towel lift and a drop fade. So for the paper towel lift, what I tell students is to grab a piece of paper towel, and we're going to be dabbing it like this, like little by little. So flatten, kind of put your paper towel to a point, and then when you flatten it, make sure that has some texture on it. Now this works best with a dark color. I used black to make it as obvious as possible, and you kind of have to work fast. So you want a decent amount of water on your brush, and you really want to saturate your brush with whatever dark color you choose to use. It works fine with any color, but I think it's just more obvious when you use black or, you know, dark blue, purple, any of those. I might get a little more water, still a little bit, and then if I test over here, pretty good. So now I'm going to kind of work fast, but you're just going to lay this down onto the paper. Now with my paper towel, I'm not going to do a motion like this. I'm just going to do one dab like that and lift. And you get a really, I love this texture. I've seen people make clouds using this. So if you have like a light blue or blue, you can make it look like clouds. So that is our paper towel lift. Pretty. Love it. Now the drop fade. A lot of people like this one. Go ahead and clean off your brush, and you are going to, kind of like the wet on wet, you are going to get your paper wet first. But with this one, you're welcome to really saturate this. It works actually better when it's very saturated. So pretty wet. Usually we don't want it this wet, but for this technique it works really well. So that's pretty saturated. You can see the glare. Now choose a color and make sure your brush is pretty saturated with that color. And by the way, you can mix watercolors together. So I'm kind of doing like a blue-green mix, and then I'm barely going to touch my brush to the paper, and it should kind of like a firework spread on your paper. Creates like a nice pretty effect as it spreads across the paper. I like to do cool colors and cool colors together. So warm and warm. It just looks nicer to me, but you're welcome to try whatever you want. I actually might get a little more water on my brush with the pigment. That might help it spread a little bit more. There we go. So these cute little dots, like a mixture of green and blue. Yeah, that one's just fun. Okay, now these next two are actually going to be the last two that I do with you, because the last two boxes that you have are free. You can do whatever you want on these. So last two that I will do with you, Oil Pastel Resist, is when you will need this oil pastel. If you have a crayon or something at home, that's fine as well. But with the oil pastel, I just like to start drawing kind of like Zentangle patterns. I don't know if you can see it that well. Maybe the light will show the waxiness. Maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah, you can't see that. But I'm doing like little, looks like citrus to me. Okay. So then with this one, what I've discovered is less pigment is better. Less pigment is better. So I'm going to pick like yellow or something. You can choose a dark color, but I've discovered that the more watery it is, I think the better it shows up. So I'm just going to start laying this down. So there's not a ton of paint, I guess I mean, on my brush. So you should see that resistance to the water. And that's just a cool interesting technique. And I might maybe try a little bit of orange on there. Do a little gradation type thing. You can do whatever you want. That looks just kind of neat. Okay, the next one is very similar, except we are using a Sharpie. Pretty easy. With our room, we will be using Sharpie on all the lines and then going over it, obviously. So if you want to have, you know, whatever type of design in here, again, I do Zentangling. You can do whatever you want. Just getting some type of pattern on there. And again, with this one, I don't care what colors you use, but it's kind of neat to experiment with multiple colors, creating like gradation type designs. I don't love this, but whatever. Okay. So maybe I do purple here. I'm gonna try purple and red. This sounds fun. But yeah, just experiment, but obviously the Sharpie stays in place, it doesn't smudge. It's just neat to try different things on that. So the last two are totally up to you what you want to do. I always like to do kind of like streaky lines like this, you know, just to try out different things, experiment, kind of play around. These are literally whatever you want them to be. Too fun. Seriously love watercolor. So yeah. And then you do whatever you want. When you're done, make sure you take a picture of these and turn it on Google Classroom.